The governor's budget and war memorial is the stadium the first conspicuous target. The governor's travels and trade his own Trans-Pacific partnership. The governor and the rest of the state Republican leadership sticking with their nominee. And if you're weary of the campaign year, the next cycles are already beginning. We'll end the suspense in a moment on Arkansas Week.
Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
This is Arkansas Week.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of AET in Sports Center. It may seem like that in a couple of minutes anyway. We're going to start with War Memorial Stadium right after we say hello to Bobby Ampazan of Arkansas Public Media, Hoyt Purvis, an independent journalist, columnist for the Northwest Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Hal Bass from the political science faculty at Ouachita Baptist University. Thanks to everybody for coming in. We were having right before the broadcast began, a sort of an old home week involving War Memorial Stadium. Hoyt, we'll go to you first because you were at the, I believe, very first event.
1948, the first game, the Razorbacks played Abilene Christian. I think the crowd was maybe a little under 30,000, which was capacity at that time. And War Memorial Stadium has become something of an icon in Arkansas and Little Rock. And it's been the scene of many well-remembered football games and other events, but its future is now somewhat in doubt.
Yeah, there is a public policy
yes,
aspect
definitely a public policy aspect, because essentially what's happened is the stadium is kind of caught in the squeeze. On the one hand, the stadium capacity in Fayetteville has increased very significantly. We've seen now the number of games played cut down to one, and that agreement only has one in Little Rock, and that agreement only has 2 more years to go, I think. And the games in Fayetteville generate far, far more revenue for the university athletic department than continuing to play in Little Rock. At one time, there used to be 3 or 4 games a year in Little Rock, and maybe a couple of three in Fayetteville. That's changed now. And on the other side, you have Governor Hutchinson, who is trying to hold down spending, and the money paid to the stadium looks like a likely a target for spending cuts.
Sure. Budgeting is arithmetic. It's not higher math. You've got to somehow figure out how to balance revenues versus expenditures. And what the governor has floated is a proposal that would cut current state funding for the stadium facility virtually in half, from almost $900,000 currently to about $450,000 beginning in fiscal year 2018, July 2018. And that's putting the stadium commissioners in a very, very difficult position of figuring out how in the world they're going to continue to maintain a facility that now requires a budget amounting to about $3.5 million per year, with the loss in revenue from the state, but also, as what suggests, the loss in revenue from the Razorback games.
This is a tough decision, I think, for this governor. This is a governor that comes from about as far from Little Rock as you can be to be governor of the state. So I think the optics of this, I don't think he takes it very lightly. He is a very budget-conscious governor, and I think a lot of people think it makes sense. I would join that, but this is a tough one, and the public reaction to this will be interesting to see over the next couple of weeks.
You know, as a piece of the general revenue budget or overall state spending, I mean, there's no money there in War Memorial Stadium, but what a lot of people are wondering is if this is a sort of a precursor, I mean, an indication of what is likely to be unveiled later in the year or early next year before the General Assembly sits and it's time to write another budget. He's on the record as virtually committed to, well, he is committed to another tax bill.
He is committed, yes. And, you know, there again, War Memorial looks like, despite all the tradition, despite all the sentiment involved with many people, it's a likely target, and there's, you know, if it's going to survive, there's going to have to be a new case made for it.
Well, Bobby, what is that case? I mean, the administrator or advocates of this could have suggested, you know, there are other ways to raise money here.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, though, are the plans for War Memorial moving forward. Of course, you know, Rex Nelson has published a piece in which he advocates transitioning away from the Razorbacks being the kind of really spectacular banner game of the year at War Memorial to something like a youth sports complex for Little Rock that would be predicated upon a sales tax for the city, which is always a tough thing. But I have to say this, I think, about this governor. He's not hidden the fact that he'd like to pass another tax cut. He also, not long ago, took some, or at least proposed tobacco master settlement money that comes to the state, shifting that over to the foster care system for agents there. And I think this is in line with the direction that is very clear, I think, both to voters and to pundits and media.
And I want to pick up on Bobby's emphasis on the geography side of this question. Heretofore, we've thought about War Memorial in statewide terms, and it may well be that the future's going to be more of a Central Arkansas, Little Rock responsibility for this facility, which creates a whole new set of opportunities, but also problems from a funding perspective. These
were a long time coming. I mean, this at least a decade, presumably from the time that the old Southwest Conference was designed, or the time the Razorbacks aligned with the Southeast Conference. The finances of it didn't look good for Little Rock from that point forward.
Right, and you know, we've gone through the stadium wars several times now. I mean, this is another sort of a round in that, but the realities have become more evident by this point, and again, it's hard to make the argument that the Razorbacks should be playing more than one game, or even if they play one game in Little Rock, despite sentiment, despite tradition, despite the value of having a sort of home away from home in Little Rock. It's evident now with 75,000 capacity basically in Fayetteville, plus a lot of skyboxes and luxury suites and all those things which have become so important in sports facilities these days. And you know, it's big business, and big business dictates that you've got to be determined by where the bucks are and where they're coming from.
Well, it was some bucks coming in from China anyway. The administration, more bucks anyway. The administration, the governor announced via Skype, I think from China anyway, that his relationship with China, or at least the work of the administration, the AEDC, the seeds of this were probably planted some time ago. I'm not sure when, Hoyt, but anyway, more Chinese capital coming to Little Rock.
This is very interesting, and of course, as you mentioned, the governor's been on a trade mission to China and was able to report what appears to be some very good news earlier this week. This is the second sort of example of Chinese involvement, investment, integration with the Arkansas economy. We had the Sun paper mill down in Howell's territory earlier announced, and now we have this garment manufacturing, which is linked with Adidas sporting wear, and would bring in 400 jobs according to the announcement, somewhere in the facility located somewhere in the Little Rock area. And this is, very interesting, particularly given all the things we've heard about China and the current political campaign, et cetera. And now we have the governor announcing the second big prize, if you want to put it that way, from China for Arkansas, which certainly can use the jobs.
And I like this announcement because Arkansas is a cotton-producing state. Suzhou Tianyuan Garment Company is a supplier for Adidas. I'd like to see in the future some synergy there, but some of the numbers on this are a little startling. They are making a $20 million investment, but the tax incentives from the state amount to more than 10% of that. The city of Little Rock, where the facility is to be based, as well as Pulaski County, have agreed to property tax incentives there that account for 2/3 of what they would normally get. So this is an incredibly incentivized deal that the governor's made with this Chinese manufacturer.
That's always the flip side, Hal.
of course,
There seems to be always the flip side.
And of course, critics bemoan the practice of the taxpayers paying a company to make money here. But supporters assure us that doing so is absolutely essential if, in fact, we're going to remain competitive in attracting economic development opportunities in an environment where our state competitors are willing and able to ante up and play the game.
Yeah, that's the way it is. That's the way this whole process works now, is the incentive package is really, in many cases, the determining factor on whether or not these projects will come into a state.
It's extremely competitive on the one hand, and so this is no doubt a great announcement, and Governor Hutchinson and his the Arkansas Economic Development Commission Director, Mike Preston, are very close. They work very closely, and frankly, I think they've had a lot of these success stories. On the other hand, if you read the early reports on this, the average wages for workers in this facility is going to be $14. $14 is less than the minimum wage laws signed by the governors of New York and California earlier this year. Now, it costs more to live in California and New York than it does in Arkansas, and $14 an hour is not a bad wage. But these are not the manufacturing jobs that built Rust Belt states like Ohio, Wisconsin,
Despite the
Michigan.
fact that robots are involved, this
Yeah.
is not really high-tech industry that we're talking about. This is a modern-day garment business.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to, although that may kind of touch, certainly it does touch on the 16 race. We have another fascinating week in the presidential race, and all of the Republican statewide district officials who had aligned or perhaps resigned themselves to Mr. Trump are, at last report, standing with him.
Sure. And I think the obvious reason is that Arkansas voters fit the Trump mold. And the constitutional officers, the federal representatives, and the party organization officials are very much aware of this goodness of fit here. I think a really interesting point is that Arkansas voters, in their transformation from their old Democratic loyalties to their current Republican loyalties, have, in a sense, lost a lot of that fascinating unpredictability that we used to attribute to them, and they behave very much like their demographic and their socioeconomic counterparts elsewhere in the country. And within the region, Arkansas was pretty late coming to the Republican camp, but we seem much more firmly rooted now than many other southern states where these aforementioned demographic and socioeconomic changes are transforming places like Virginia and North Carolina, Florida, perhaps even Georgia now, and making them at least more attractive to Democratic Party appeals, while Arkansas seems to remain very much ensconced within the Republican camp now.
Yeah.
This to me was interesting, using two that I looked at, found. Two statistical models give Secretary Clinton, who was First Lady in Arkansas for what, 18, or a long time, here for a long time. They give her approximately 5 times more, she's 5 times more likely to win Indiana, the home state of the Republican vice presidential nominees, 5 times more likely to win Indiana than she is Arkansas. Her odds here are just negligible.
Well, there are a lot of interesting dimensions, and certainly I sort of second what Hal said in terms of the way Arkansas is positioned, which is basically nobody's paying any attention to Arkansas because it's assumed to be very much in the Trump camp. But one of the things I find interesting here is that, and you find this among the Republican office holders in Arkansas, governor, members of Congress, et cetera, and that is, yes, they're critical. They don't like the things that Trump is saying. His rhetoric is over the top, et cetera. But the rationale for continuing to support Trump is, in many cases, well, he would have the Supreme Court nominations. But the irony here is that given the impact of Trump, it now looks as if the Democrats have a chance to win majority in the Senate. Now, regardless of who has a majority in the Senate, Democrats might get possibly, if everything went their way, 53 members of the Senate. But it takes 60% to break 60 votes to break a filibuster, and neither side is going to really. I think we're looking at a continued logjam on Supreme Court as well as other things. So I don't think that rationale holds up nearly as well now as it might have a few months ago.
Building on Hoyt's point, I do think that this year's cycle makes clear that the strong party loyalties that we're seeing in contemporary American national and state politics are really as much negative as they are positive. Mm-hmm. That is to say, it's not so much we are loyal Democrats or Republicans as we just cannot stand the possibility of the opposition party prevailing, and that's guiding and directing our behavior.
Yeah, Bob?
Well, and to your point, Steve, about Hillary Clinton being a first lady here, and this state is certainly going to go for Trump. Meanwhile, she's winning Indiana, which has the Republicans have the VP nominee out of the governor of Indiana. There was a graphic, a map that made the circle.
No, I'm not sure she's winning Indiana. Her odds are just better in Indiana.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. There was a polling data suggests that if you were to remove all the male voters from the electorate and just look at how women are voting, of course the map just sweeps blue for Clinton, except in 12 states, about a dozen states. Arkansas is one of them. So if only Arkansas women voted, the state would still vote for Donald Trump. And I think it's to your point, Hal, that I think it's so entrenched and we're so frequently voting so that the other side doesn't get their agenda through, that we're willing to overlook a lot of foibles. And I think this goes for both sides, really, both candidates.
Well, you saw a map 4 years ago in which it was, what if only white males voted in the last presidential election? And it was coast to coast it was red. There were just a few counties.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, actually, that's very true, although it appears as if Hillary Clinton has dented that somewhat in the last week or two. As again, if you believe the polls, and I don't place ultimate confidence in the polls being precisely right, but trends are pretty clearly evident at this point.
Where Hillary's and the Democrats' inroads have been most significant, at least according to survey data, in this cycle is with the college-educated population, who have traditionally, as long as we've been paying attention to their voting behavior, leaned decisively in the Republican direction, and are again indicating that they're going Democrat this time.
Okay, let's keep it really narrow. At least at first, anyway. And as Attorney General Rutledge got out early in front of everybody, 2 years away, and she's raising money.
Yeah, she's raised over $70,000, she reported. This is going to seem early to a lot of folks, but I have to say that I think despite
Today it's never too early.
It's never too early, and despite her kind of tripping exchange with Bob Schieffer a few weeks ago after, I think, was it the first debate, she's had a lot of publicity this election cycle. She's looked like a stalwart for the Republican nominee, who, as we just talked about, is polling so well in the state. I think this was a smart move by her, and I think that I think that her polling numbers would be pretty good. I will point out that in the last election cycle, Tom Cotton, the senator for Arkansas, as well as Governor Asa Hutchinson, both bested their Democratic challengers by roughly about 15 percentage points. She beat the Democratic nominee for Attorney General, Nate Steele, by just about 8 points, so much closer there.
Yep.
Well, it's interesting because, as Bobby said, she's gotten a lot of publicity. She's done well in that regard, getting a lot of attention, and probably while that she's sort of at a high point there, it's maybe a good idea to go ahead and announce. There's another way of looking at this, given her very, very solid support for Trump. At an earlier point, when it looked like Trump might be possibly winning, she would have seemed like someone who might have found a very prime position in Washington. Now, whether that has entered into her thinking, who knows, or not. But clearly she's somebody to watch, I think, in Arkansas politics, if not national politics.
Well, we're certainly watching the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton, who seems to be everywhere, at least everywhere that Republican influentials gather.
Most notably Iowa, which will be the first contest in the 2020 race. Well, we're not even finished 2016 yet. But Cotton has positioned himself, I think, very adroitly as a bridge builder within a divided Republican Party. He has very, very solid, what you might call establishment or party elite support, particularly among the neoconservative wing of the party. But he also has maintained the support of the rank and file, including the Trump insurgents, through his strident opposition to all things Obama/Clinton. And there's not that many people who, at least on the surface, seem positioned, as well as he does, to find common ground between those two groups in what is a divided party.
His personal story is fantastic. It's pedigree. And I think that he made the decision early in this election cycle to stay a little out of the fray. And I think that's proven to be smart. So I think that on paper and over the last year, he's positioned himself very well for 2020. And as we know, a couple of generations ago, we wanted our presidential candidates to be seasoned. Not so anymore. This election cycle featured Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, two first-term senators. So it seems like you got to get out and make the run early.
Well, we have an incumbent president who wasn't terribly seasoned when he took the oath of office.
Right. He was a freshman senator.
Well, I think it's been interesting to watch Senator Cotton, because I've had the feeling, and I think Bobby sort of touched on this, that he has kind of stepped back a little bit. That's not to say he's been less, but he hasn't had that kind of hard edge to him that a lot of people seem to observe at the beginning of his time in the Senate. He's definitely somebody to watch. There's no question about it.
Where does this take the rest of the Republic? Is there an opening? We're about to see if the polls are correct. We're about to see a substantial Democratic victory for the White House. How can you narrow that down a little bit? Where is Mr. Cotton's opening? Obviously, not just the neocons, but
Well, again,
he's covered on the social agenda as well.
It's finding common ground, but I think the real question that the Republican Party is going to face, assuming that the polls are indicative of the outcome, pertains to the margin, and we won't know that until November 9th here. That is to say, a decisive Trump defeat is a very different story from a relatively narrow Trump defeat in terms of the way forward. The potential for Cotton, again, strikes me is greatest if you're looking for, as I said earlier, someone who really can bridge a chasm between the establishment and the insurgents here. We're going to have to wait and see how the election turns out, and really how Trump and the Trump supporters handle the likelihood of a defeat right now going forward. Whether they want to be revolutionaries or whether they want to be good sports.
It is still quite possible that Secretary Clinton, if the polls are correct, can win the White House handily, but with less than a majority of the popular vote.
Sure.
But her husband did that twice.
Yeah.
I would point out, too, that the last time that one party held the White House...
And his successor as well.
held the White House for 8 years and then got their next candidate elected was, of course, between 80 and 92. That ended with the ascendance of Arkansas's first U.S. president. So if I'm the Republican Party, the silver lining on this year, presuming that that Hillary Clinton does win, is I think that you should feel bullish about 2020.
Well, certainly not just 2020, but 2018, in the sense of midterm elections, ought to favor the party that's out of power. And certainly the Senate map in 2018 looks much more attractive for the Republicans than 2016.
Democrats have an awful lot of seats to defend in 18.
Well, the whole issue of the future of the Republican Party is going to be one of the most significant things to watch, because regardless, I mean, if Trump wins, that's one thing, but if Trump loses, and given all the division within the party and the establishment and Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and others, they're and Rance Priebus, people like that, I mean, do they have a future, or are they the future of the Republican Party?
Got to end it there. We're out of time. Guys, thanks to you for coming in. As always, thanks to you for watching. See you next week.
Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.